Hello, in this video we will talk about control rig, the new layered control rig, and we'll use constraints in combination with this new layer control rig to have Echo here grab a sword. So let's go ahead and chat about Echo for a second. You can get her from Fab, and she's amazing. She's from Epic Games, so she's completely free. And we have her right here, Windwalker Echo. Now you'll need to download her and create a project for herself. She has a create project in the Epic Games launcher. It doesn't have for now, or at least for now, she's not a standalone that you can add to any project. She needs her own project. But that doesn't mean that you can't create the project and then migrate her to your own, exactly like I did here. So right here we have Echo. We're using the VP Echo Live Link, which is ideal for the situation. And remember that every time we bring in a blueprint into sequencer, we always need to access, in this case I had already done it, we always need to access the skeleton mesh component. So in this case, I know that the skeleton mesh component, in this particular case for her, is named body. So let's go ahead and add an animation. So by clicking on the plus track icon, let's go up to animation and let's choose the add an animation. So as soon as we do that, we see that Echo is effectively running the animation. And in the old days, what we would do to have her, for example, look to the right, would have been right-clicking on it, on the body, on the skeletal mesh, baking to control rig, and bringing in her control rig. Now there's a couple of issues with this. For one, what it does is it bakes every single keyframe on every single frame for every single bone, making it a little bit cumbersome to work with. Now, sometimes we do need this because we might want to delete an entire section of animation from one particular bone. But in most cases, if we want to do a simple animation or modification to a pre-existing one, this is a little troublesome. Now, at that point in time, what we would do was creating a new section, an additive section, and what we would do was, for example, let's say I want her looking right in this animation, I would turn her right, and that would mean that now for the entirety of this animation, because this is an additive section, and that means that anything I add, it will be on top of pre-existing animation. So that means that now she is completely looking to the right for the entirety of this section. Now that's great, and that was the old way of doing things. It worked, and it does still work for a couple of things. Like I said, if we want to keep or clean some specific animation that came in incorrectly and we need to delete it completely, we still need to bake it to a control rig. But let's talk about the new kid on the block. Let's right click on this animation sequence and set it to active, juggle it up so physics apply correctly. And instead of baking this animation to a control rig, what we'll do right now is adding a layered control rig. So we're going to hit the plus icon in the Skelly mesh. We're going to go to control rig, and we're going to make sure that layered is enabled. Now, this is a new tool that came in with Unreal Engine 5.4. So if you don't find it in 5.3 or earlier, it's because it's not there. You need to be on 5.4 onwards. So layer control rig. And as soon as we have that, we can go and add the same Echo body control rig that we did before. But in this particular time, what's happening is, first and foremost, we get a new track that is the same name, but it has layered in parentheses. And the second thing that happens is that this is a different color. And the third is that our animation has not been deactivated. You can see that the animation is live at the same time as our control rig is up, which previously, if our control rig was up, meant we baked it to the control rig, baked the animation to the control rig, and that meant that we had no longer any animation running. It was everything run by keyframes through controls. So in this particular case, a layer control rig is actually live, and let me demonstrate that to you. If I right click on my animation track and go all the way up to properties, and then select a different animation, for example, walk forward, this animation has root motion, so she'll be actually moving forward, you'll see that the layer rig is still up. And what's even better, if I decide now to make a very noticeable modification in our layer control rig additive section, layer control rigs behave as additives. If I lower her down, that modification without any keyframes, because remember, this is additive, applies to this animation. But look at what happens if I actually decide to switch back the animation to our idle animation. So I am going to right click on our animation, go back to animation property and change it back to idle. Our layer is still active, thus still applying the modification that we applied while she was in the walk forward animation to this animation. Now, one thing that you'll be noticing here is that I didn't place any keyframe down. And that means that we don't, that is because this is an additive layer. And if we don't protect our pre-existing animation, any modifications that we make will be applied to the entirety of the animation running on top. So how do we protect that section? So let's actually re-bring in that layer control rig. So we'll do that again by hitting plus icon in the Scaly Mesh body in this case. We're going to go for layered and once again, echo body control rig. Now we're back at new. So how do we protect pre-existing animation? It's actually pretty simple. We need to tell the additive layer to not do anything up to a specific point. So we'll do it with her head. What I want to do here is up to frame 30, I want her looking exactly the way she is. So we'll set down here a keyframe for her head control. And there it is. So in between 30 and 90, or at least 105, I am going to set down another keyframe. And what we're doing here is essentially telling the transformation, rotation, and well, scale, we'll never use scale and control, so transformation and rotation information to stay at 0. Now remember, this is an additive section. We are adding 0, and that means take whatever information was there from the actual animation sequence that is being given to your head control through that animation sequence. So we're adding 0. So we're protecting it in between frames 105 or further than 105 and earlier than 30. We're protecting that information because in here, what I'll do is I'll add a turn of her head to the right. So you can see that up to this point, now she's looking right, but up to frame 30, she's keeping the entire information that she had previously. From 30 onwards, she's applying the rotation. Let's keep that rotation for a little longer. And then, once she's done with that animation, she's going back to 0 additive information on this protective keyframe that we set up in here. So that is how you protect any animation that you want from the pre-existing layer of animation sequences. So let's say that we want to do more modifications, but we kind of want to keep everything organized. Let's remove this and let's rename this. We can head look right. Let's rename this to head look right layered. And what we can do is in this specific layered, we can add another additive section. Now everything is going to be named like that. That was my mistake. Let's do control rig layered. And now everything changes names, but we can do it down here. Head look right layered. And there we go. And now let's say we can do something like kneeling layered. So in this one, now that we have it clicked, because you'll notice that there's a green outline around our tracks, that once I switch from them, it sets them to active. That means that now that I have the top one, the bottom one selected, if I were to now make her kneel down, let's say we do this, we're going to set down a keyframe. We're not going to protect any information here. We're literally and straightforward going to have her kneel down. Let's see if we can make her do this. And let's modify our pole vector. And let's say we don't want that feet to be completely squashed. So we'll do something like this. And then we will modify this very dandy and cool control we have here. There we go. She's almost kneeling down, but that's perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. We probably want to fix this feet too. So let's go ahead and do that really quickly. Again, pole vectors are going to be our friends here, modifying the direction of the knee. Let's move it into the middle. Come on. There we go. We were selecting a ghost pole vector. And there we are. Something like that. That works great. So now she's going to be running any animation that previously was there, and she's kneeling down. so we can have a separate action on separate layers for whatever we want. And again, if we mute this layer or disable it, we'll see that she goes back up and then she goes back down. So we have everything separate. Now it comes down to exporting this animation to have it as an animation sequence, because we mostly never want to keep keyframes or baked keyframes in the previous case on a sequencer that we will render. But here's a problem. If we were to bake this animation out, as we usually did in the past and we usually still do, through baking an animation sequence, we would go to animation and then we will choose a name and it will be idle kneeling look right or something like that. That's a great name for an animation. We're going to hit OK. We're going to export the animation. And let's take a look at it. We'll see that effectively we have her kneeling, we have her doing the idle, and she's looking to the right. So that's great. And at that point, what we would do in our sequence here is delete all of our layers here and bring in just the animation that we had previously. But there's a problem with that, because let's say we want to keep modifying the kneeling position or modify anything else that we may come up with. But we've already baked that animation and proceeded to delete our layered, right? Let's say we deleted our layered and we brought in the new animation. Let's actually delete this one and bring it in. And this was kneel. So there we go. Now we have this animation. Now if we bring another additive layer here, obviously it's a new one. It won't contain everything we did in the past. This is a new layer. So we can work through this and we can do this like that, but we're missing our previous keyframes. So let me Ctrl Z to get all the way back there. And let me show you a very, very cool tool that we can use here in Unreal to keep our information here on a separate sequencer. Let's say this is not the sequence that contains my camera, it contains my actual shot, and I am working on this animation. What I can do, instead of baking it to an animation sequence, is right-clicking on it and creating a linked animation sequence. Now this tool is awesome. Let's do kneeling, and we'll just call this one linked. We're going to hit OK, and we're going to export the animation with the default values. Now nothing happened. Oh, I missed a click there. Almost got him. Nothing happened here. Obviously, we just exported an animation. We just baked it. So let me actually go ahead and search for it. I'm going to call for linked. And we're going to open kneeling linked. So you see that this is the same animation. She's missing her hair here because it's a different skeletal mesh. But what happens now is this. Let's say I change something on this particular sequencer on this animation. I'm going to make her lean forward a little more. And we're going to change one more of these. We'll do this and keep it like that. Now, the minute I hit save, look at what happened to our linked animation right here on the right-hand side. It actually got updated. Linked animations are actually live, and they are linked, as the word says, to their sequencer, to whatever we're doing with that animation in our sequence before we baked it out. So now that we've created that link, we can continuously modify it here, and the export would be automatic. So that means that any save here will save our linked animation. And this is a separate asset that we can then use on our actual existing sequence that contains our camera and any of our animation. So that is absolutely great. We can do this with Bake Control Rig 2. We're just showcasing it with layer because it's 2 layers of actual organic and alive modification to our animations, which is absolutely awesome. Let's remove one of our layers and let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about this rig. We can also use this great layer control rig to work with something called constraints in Unreal Engine. Many of you may already know them. I have a sword here. Let's bring it over and let's actually use this to make Echo hold the sword and then put it on her back. So we'll showcase the switch between different constraints. So let's make sure we have our layer rig here prepared. And what we'll first do before we go on is make sure that once we have our layer right here and we go to the global, we switch our arms to inverse kinematics. That'll make our life easier and it's going to look way better once we work with it. So the first thing we'll do is very quickly pose one of her hands because I want to have her holding this sword with both hands. So you see how easy it is now to work with something like that, whereas in the past it was a little bit problematic. So let's make sure we are working with everything that we want here. And let's have her hold her sword with one hand, and then we'll bring over the second hand. So I'm going to quickly position the sword. It's not going to be super perfect because we're doing this live here, but it is okay. And let's bring it over. So we'll position both of her hands first, and then we'll work with the constraints. And there's a couple ways of doing this, but there are safe ways and then there's problematic ways. So what we'll do first and foremost is make sure that she's not getting wrecked by any of that. So let's actually rotate her torso a little bit so we get some help from our body because the IKs are suffering a little bit here. We'll probably need to push the hand back as this is not working as I want, going too much, and we probably want to have the hand a little higher so this doesn't break. There we go. We're going to do this, and then we are going to push the shoulder out just slightly. Have our pull vector here help out with pushing the, there we go, the elbow out. That's exactly what I wanted. I'll push it a little further out so we have more control over what's happening here. And move the hand down just slightly and then push it back. Rotate it, and then we'll simply reposition our other hand, which is the easy one to move. So we get that effect that we're looking for. We're almost there. There we go. That's perfect. I'm just going to leave it there for now. And what we'll do right here is finally end up working with constraints with just one more thing like that, and there we go. So we're gonna have her hold the sword, but remember this is a layered control rig. So if we were to right now constrain both hands to the sword, this is what would happen, and let me show it to you. We're going to, with one of the controls selected, we're going to hit here in constraints as long as we have animation mode up, which we should as soon as we bring in a layer control rig or any control rig into sequencer. Animation mode is going to be enabled automatically. So with one of the control hands open or selected, what we'll do is add a constraint. We're going to go straight for the parent constraint, and that's going to give us the eyedropper, and we're going to choose the sword. In this case, the sword is a skeletal mesh. We're going to go for the root, and that's perfectly fine. There's a little glitch there, but nothing happened really. It was just a glitch. And then what we'll do is the same thing with the other hand. So we'll parent it to the sword root. There we go. Now the issue about that is that now you can see that her hands are completely locked to the sword. Even though the control is moving, the hand is not really moving. It's jittering a little bit, but it's not. You can see that hand is not really moving. That was just a graphical glitch. So the hand is not moving. Now I would need to animate the sword to have both hands move. Now we may want this, but what I want is actually to keep my animation from the pre-existing animation, because remember this is a layered control rig. So I want to keep that animation. So what I'll do right now is I'll delete both constraints by going here to the constraint section, selecting both hands, and I'll simply delete them. And what I'll do is the opposite. I'll select the sword, and I will constrain the sword to one of my controls. In this case, I'll choose the right hand. Now that means that any movement that that right hand has will be followed by the sword. So you can see that now my right hand is still moving and the sword is moving with the right hand rather than the opposite. Now you can see that the left hand is flowing around. So this one we do need to anchor. So in this case, we'll pick either or. We can pick the sword because the sword is being moved by the right hand, or we can pick, we can't pick the right hand. So it has to be, oh yeah, we can, which is again, another graphical glitch here. So we'll pick the sword in this particular case. So we're gonna, again, select the hand, and we're gonna bring a constraint. It's gonna be a parent constraint, and we're gonna select the sword. And hit none. And now both hands are effectively following the sword. And that's great. And at any point in time, I can choose to have one of those constraints drop. Again, if we have the sword here constrained to this control, any movement that I add, let's add a couple of keyframes here. Remember, this is a layer control rig, so anything we add, it's going to be added on top. So we'll do something like this. Have a raised sword or something. There we go. This is being added. Oh, a couple of issues there. This is being added on top of the pre-existing animation, which is great. And let's make it obvious. So at any point in time, I can select this other hand. And in here, in the constraints section, what I can do is I can turn the constraint on off. Let's take a look in sequencer at how that constraint looks. And this is exactly what it looks like. It's a green bar. It's infinite right now, and it's turning on at frame 0. But if I were to select this hand, and then at this point in time, click on the keyframe here, that'll kill the constraint up to that point, and that means that this hand is now free to move wherever it wants. So let's put the hand back to its original position, or somewhere like that. And there we go. We have this effect. And the same as we did right now, we can do even more. What we can do with this sword here in the hand is, at this point in time, let's say I want this hand, and that's why she is dropping it on the other hand. She's dropping the other hand. Let's put this sword on her back. So let's work a little bit with it, and let's see if we can get this to go on the back without many issues. Let's go ahead and do something like this. We're having a keyframe, sure, we'll leave it there so we don't run into hours of animation. And we obviously want to fix this so she's not running the sword through her face as we are doing this. So we'll work with the animation just slightly, and let's move the arm out so wrist is not completely destroyed. And there we go, something like that. And she puts the sword on her back. So up to this point, what we can do is we can tell the sword to no longer be constrained to that hand and to be constrained to the back. So what we'll do here is make sure we are selecting our sword and looking at the constraints, and we'll turn the constraint off, and we'll create a new constraint. And that new parent constraint will be, let's say, let's pick this. We want to pick the control. We don't want to pick the entirety of her body. This is probably the volume that's having an issue. So let's start over, select the sword. We turned off the constraint to the hand. And what we'll do is we'll bring a new parent constraint, and there we go. That's exactly what I wanted. We'll select spine 3. So if everything worked, we should be able to now simply move this hand out of the way. And you can see that effectively is keeping the sword in place. And we can move the hand down, because she put the sword on her back, and now the sword is being constrained to her back. And it's continuously moving due to the animation of the spine. So this is what we got in the end. And there we go. So that is how you are able to use constraints in Unreal Engine 5.4 through a layered control rig. which is great. It's pretty straightforward. There are some issues here and there that you may run into, nothing that some work can't fix. And this is all, again, live, right? We could live link this. We could link this to a linked animation sequence, and that is also going to be live, and we can continuously modify this. We could even change the sorts, right? Let's actually go ahead and change the sorts. If we go here to the details panel, we should be able to switch this for another sort, and let's see how this one looks. Preparing a couple of shaders, and there we go. This is just simply a instance of a skeletal mesh that contains a skeletal mesh component, and we're changing the properties of said skeletal mesh components. So another great thing about Unreal is that everything is kind of organic. So it's there. You can change it. We could change it through logic, we could change it through whatever we want, but in this case, we're going for the simple way. And that's awesome. This is constraints being used on a layer control rig. So remember how I said some things are still needed to be done through baking to a control rig? Well, the next thing I will show you is one of those things where you're gonna have better luck by using the previous iteration of this rather than a layer control rig, and that is spaces. So let me go ahead and show you what I mean by this and what are spaces. Spaces essentially are a way of telling one control to be commanded by another one instead of its parent. So let me go ahead and very quickly showcase that for you. So we're going to right click, and this time we are going to bake to control rig. We're not going to add a layered control rig. We're going to bake it because this is the easiest way of getting this process done. I'm going to create a bake to that control rig, and the first thing we will do is under the global control here on our body control rig. Remember, this baked every single frame, so we need to delete all of these except the first one, because what we'll do is we will switch the left hand, and if I were to leave every single one of the other keyframes, it's going to switch back to FK. In this particular situation, what I want is the left hand to be on an IK. That way, it lets me do what I'm going to showcase next. And another thing we need to do is leave and delete, not leave, delete all the keyframes from the hand. What we'll do now is make sure that this hand is on her hip at all times throughout this animation in a very simple 1 or 2 clicks way. I'm going to simply put the hand right there. That's good enough for me. Without keyframing anything, without moving anything else, what we'll do is in our animation mode here on the top left, as we've been working with constraints, right now we are not going to work with constraints. We are going to work with something else, and that is spaces. So what we'll do is we are going to select spine 01. Oops, it's an underscore there. Yeah, there we go. We're going to select spine, and as we do that, right now that hand is following its parent. So right now it's not following anything because it deleted all the keyframes, but it would follow the shoulder. If I were to move the shoulder, well, it's an IK. Obviously, it's not going to move. It's going to stand still. But if we were to switch it to world, it's again not going to follow the arm. It's going to stay there. And in the final one, if we now switch it to spine, what will happen now is that that hand, instead of following the parent or whatever else, it will follow the spine. It's like a constraint, but it's not exactly the same. So what's happening now is that that spine throughout the animation is going to lead that hand, and we'll see it here in a second, play live. And there we go. You see the hand is completely anchored to that new space, which is in this case the spine, and it's locked there. Now this is great for things like this, where we put the hand on the waist of a character. This is great for things like, for example, putting the hand. Let's do that again. Let's do another example here, which is awesome. let's go ahead and select the hand so we can make sure that we are on the correct space. Let's go back to parent for a second. Let's put the hand on her head as if she were talking with a cell phone. So let's go ahead and put the hand over here. And let's obviously here in a second, we're gonna fix that pole vector that is getting destroyed. So we'll put the pole vector somewhere around here. That's fine. Again, we're not gonna go super crazy on this. And remember, we baked everything. So as soon as I move the pole vector, I need to make sure I delete everything else. Otherwise, if I don't leave that, yep, look at that, it's going back to original position. So if we go here, now we're fine. That's the spine doing that little jump there. We can quickly fix that first frame, which is simply going to delete it. There we go. Now her hand is standing still, but it's not, she looks like she's grabbing her head. We'll do that, not the phone call. But the hand is sticking in the air. So what we'll need to do now is once again, grab another space, but in this case, we're gonna go for the head. Make sure we activate that space. They look pretty similar to constraints. And there we go. It is now locked to the head. So any movement the head will do, the hand will follow. What is the difference between spaces and constraints? Well, constraints work for external actors, while spaces only work within the control rig itself. And what we can do here is, once again, up to this point, we can switch it to go back to parent, and you'll see that it effectively behaves as normal, and I can put the hand down now. Or let's say she puts the hand forward and does some kind of wave or something like that. And there we go. So she's gonna be locked, and then she unlocks and moves her hand forward. So that's the other tool that I wanted to showcase today, Spaces. So we talked about layer control rig. We saw how it works in difference from our actual bake to control rig, previous iteration of this. We used several layers of that control rig to affect several sections. We baked that animation to a linked animation sequence that is alive, and we can continuously save on top of it. And then we explore constraints, and we use that to put a sword on Echo's hand and then on her back. And we came back to baking to control rig to use spaces because they work better with a bake control rig rather than a layered. And we used it to showcase how we can anchor one control to another parent through spaces with her hand on her waist and then her hand on her head.